What if a single drone smaller than a car could shatter the energy security of an entire continent overnight? That is not a hypothetical. That is exactly what happened. And what comes next will reshape how Europe heats its homes, powers its factories, and makes its most important economic decisions for the next 20 years. Before we go any further, here is what I need from you right now. If you care about understanding the real forces reshaping our world, not the headlines, but the deep mechanics underneath them, hit that subscribe button. Share this video with one person who follows energy or global politics, and drop a like if you want more content like this. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who are hungry for analysis that actually goes somewhere. Now let's get into it. On the morning of March 2nd, 2026, an Iranian drone hit the Ras Laffan industrial complex on the coast of Qatar. The explosion itself was contained to a specific section of the facility. The damage was real but limited in physical terms. A few pieces of gas processing equipment, a stretch of pipeline infrastructure feeding into the export terminals. But the consequences were not limited at all. Ras Laffan is not just a large facility, it is the single largest liquefied natural gas export complex on the planet. In 2025, it shipped approximately 81 million metric tons of LNG. That number represents roughly 20% of everything that moved through the global seaborne gas market in an entire year. Every cargo that leaves Ras Laffan has to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. There is no other route, there is no backup port, and according to current Qatari estimates, restoring the damaged infrastructure will take somewhere between 3 and 5 years. 3 to 5 years, not weeks, not months, years. Within hours of the strike, the assumptions that had quietly held European energy policy together for nearly a decade began to fall apart. And 47 days later, we are watching the fastest strategic realignment of natural gas supply since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. To understand what this actually means, you need to understand what stopped moving. Within 2 weeks of the strike, a Qatari-flagged LNG carrier that had been scheduled to deliver its cargo to the Dunkirk regasification terminal in France on March 28th was quietly redirected to storage off the coast of Singapore. Its delivery slot was canceled. The French utility that had contracted for that cargo issued a force majeure notice to its downstream customers. One ship, one cargo, one broken contract. Now multiply that by every Qatari vessel scheduled to arrive at a European terminal between March 2nd and the end of April. Vessel tracking data puts that number at approximately 37 carriers, 37 cargoes that simply vanished from Europe's supply calendar in the space of a few weeks. The immediate impact landed hardest in Germany. On April 3rd, the German government revised its 2026 growth forecast down to 0.6%. The previous projection, issued just months earlier in the autumn of 2025, had been 1.3%. More than half of Germany's expected economic growth for the entire year was erased in a single announcement. And the reason was not a banking crisis. It was not weak exports or consumer spending. It was energy. Germany's economy minister Katharina Reiche, a former executive who came into office under Chancellor Friedrich Merz last year, said something remarkable in an interview with the Financial Times. She said, "We need gas to secure our supply. That is the only base load supply I have left. Politically speaking, I have no alternative." Read that again slowly. The economy minister of Europe's largest economy told an international newspaper on the record that her country has no alternative to natural gas as a base load power source. Not as a preference, not as a bridge fuel while renewables catch up, as a structural fact about how the German economy functions. Germany shut down its nuclear fleet. It has been winding down coal. Its renewable energy capacity is real and growing, but wind and solar are intermittent by nature. They produce energy when conditions allow it. What keeps the grid stable when the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining? What keeps BASF's chemical reactors running around the clock in Ludwigshafen? What keeps the steel mills operating in the Ruhr? Gas. And that gas just became dramatically more expensive and far less certain. Let's put actual numbers on this. Futures contracts for German electricity delivery in May 2026 are currently trading at approximately 4 times the level of equivalent French contracts. 4 times. This is not a temporary premium on a short disruption. This is a structural price gap that reflects something real. France's nuclear fleet is largely intact and still generating stable, predictable baseload power. Germany's is gone. And in the current environment, that difference is being priced into every industrial decision made on German soil. For a company like BASF, which runs the largest integrated chemical production complex in the world from its headquarters in Ludwigshafen, this is not an abstract concern. BASF uses natural gas as both a fuel and a feedstock. It needs gas to generate heat and steam for its production processes. It also needs gas as a raw material for producing ammonia, methanol, and a cascade of downstream chemical products that end up in fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, and industrial materials across Europe and globally. When gas prices quadruple relative to what competitors in France and Spain are paying, BASF cannot simply raise its prices and pass the cost through. Its products compete on global markets. Customers have choices. So BASF has already announced production curtailments at multiple German sites for the second quarter of 2026, citing what it calls unsustainable feedstock and energy cost differentials. Steel producers have issued similar signals. Production at energy-intensive German steel mills is being scaled back. Output is shifting toward lower energy grades and increasingly toward importing semi-finished steel slabs that can be processed at German facilities without running the full blast furnace cycle. These are not peripheral companies. These are the industrial anchors of the German export economy. And when they cut back production in April and May of 2026, the effects ripple outward through supply chains, employment, tax revenues, and GDP. European benchmark gas prices have climbed more than 50% since the day of the Reshape strikes. And the reason those prices have held at that level is not speculation or panic, it is storage. When the Qatari cargoes stopped arriving, European gas storage was already unusually low for this time of year. As of early March, EU storage was roughly 30% full against a 10-year average of 54% at the same point in the calendar. That deficit was not caused by the drone strike. It was the result of a cold 2025 winter that drew inventories down faster than the replenishment cycle could rebuild them. So Europe entered the Qatar shutdown already weakened, and it has not recovered since. This is the second time in 4 years that Europe has faced a crisis of this character. The first came in February 2022 when Russia's invasion of Ukraine forced the continent to rebuild its entire gas architecture under enormous pressure after decades of dependency on Russian pipeline flows. That rebuild cost a staggering amount of money. It was disruptive in ways that took years to fully absorb. Germany constructed floating LNG import terminals at Wilhelmshaven and Brunsbüttel in record time. France expanded capacity at Fos-sur-Mer and Dunkirk. New contracts were signed with Qatar, the United States, and Norway. And for 3 winters, it worked. At considerable cost, but it worked. The core assumption embedded in that rebuilt architecture was that Qatar would remain a stable supplier. That assumption was not careless. Qatar had been one of the world's most reliable LNG exporters for more than 2 decades. Its facilities had never experienced a serious disruption. Its government had maintained commercial relationships through earlier regional tensions without interrupting deliveries. The assumption was reasonable, and then it failed on March 2nd, 2026. Now, here's a question that every European energy minister has had to wrestle with since the strikes. Why not simply buy more American gas? The United States is currently the largest single source of LNG arriving in Europe by volume. American cargoes from Gulf Coast export terminals, Sabine Pass, Corpus Christi, Freeport, have been the primary replacement for Russian pipeline gas since 2022. In the first half of 2025, American LNG accounted for roughly 57% of European LNG imports. On paper, the obvious response to losing Qatari supply is to scale American volumes further. The logic is clean. The politics are not. The Trump administration has made European trade relationships one of its most active areas of economic pressure. Tariff threats on European exports, public criticism of European defense spending, disputes over digital services regulation, friction across multiple commercial sectors. The result is a bilateral environment in which European governments are genuinely reluctant to deepen their strategic dependency on the United States for any critical input. This is not a rejection of American gas. The cargoes continue to arrive, but there is a clear and consistent signal from European capitals that concentration risk is a real concern. and that signing additional long-term contracts with a supplier whose government has demonstrated willingness to use economic leverage in unpredictable ways is itself a form of vulnerability. Chancellor Merz made an oblique but unmistakable reference to this in a speech in late March. He talked about the lesson of the past 4 years. He did not mention the United States by name. He did not need to. The lesson, as he described it, is that a European economy cannot afford to be structurally dependent on any single external supplier for a critical input, regardless of how friendly or hostile that supplier currently appears. Diversification, he said, is not an economic preference. It is a strategic requirement, and that brings us to Canada, not Canadian LNG in general, specifically Atlantic Canadian LNG, because the distinction between Canada's two export pathways is the single most important geographical fact in understanding why Europe is pivoting in this direction. Canada's first export pathway runs along the Pacific coast. The LNG Canada terminal at Kitimat in British Columbia has been exporting since 2024. Its cargoes cross the Pacific and reach buyers in Japan, South Korea, China, and India. That infrastructure matters, but it is not the European story. A ship sailing from Kitimat to Wilhelmshaven would have to transit the Panama Canal and cross the entire Atlantic. The route is technically possible, but it puts Pacific Canadian gas in direct competition with Asian demand that is already absorbing every available ton. The second pathway is the Atlantic coast, and this is where the European story lives. The Goldboro LNG project in Guysborough County, Nova Scotia, has been in various stages of development for over a decade. Permits have been granted, allowed to expire, and reconstituted under different ownership arrangements. For most of that history, Goldboro was a project that made sense in theory, but could never quite secure the long-term purchase commitments needed to justify construction. The economics were always dependent on European buyers who were not yet ready to lock in. That has changed. Under the Carney government's fast-track framework for strategically significant energy infrastructure, Goldboro has entered accelerated development. The Bearhead LNG facility, also in Nova Scotia, has received parallel regulatory attention. And a third potential pathway, converting existing natural gas pipeline infrastructure running from Alberta through central Canada to Atlantic ports, including St. John in New Brunswick, is under active commercial evaluation. The shipping numbers make the case almost by themselves. An LNG carrier sailing from Nova Scotia to Wilhelmshaven covers that distance in approximately 9 days. To Dunkirk in France, approximately 8 days. The route crosses the North Atlantic, the most commercially mature long-distance shipping corridor in the world. It does not pass through the Strait of Hormuz. It does not pass through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, where Houthi forces have been targeting commercial shipping since 2024. It does not require transit through the Red Sea or the Suez Canal. It does not require war risk insurance premiums. It does not require military escorts. Now compare that to a Qatari cargo in normal peacetime conditions. That route transits Hormuz, crosses the Arabian Sea, passes through the Bab el-Mandeb, runs up the Red Sea, transits Suez, and then crosses the Mediterranean before reaching a European terminal. Under normal conditions, the full journey takes more than 3 weeks. Every single segment carries political risk that is priced into the insurance premium. Every segment passes through a zone where state or non-state actors have demonstrated both the capability and the willingness to disrupt commercial shipping. Atlantic Canadian gas is closer, it is faster, it sits behind no contested choke points, and it is the only available option that simultaneously satisfies all 4 conditions European buyers actually need: long-term contracting, secure shipping lanes, competitive pricing, and a politically stable supplier with democratic governance and a track record of commercial reliability. That is why the phone calls started, and that is why a German delegation traveled to Ottawa in the first week of April, including senior officials from the Economy Ministry and representatives from the major German utilities Uniper and RWE to begin what press accounts described as exploratory discussions focused on long-term offtake commitments. All right, pause right here for a second. If this kind of deep dive analysis is something you find valuable, I want to ask you something different. Don't just like this video. Send it to someone who wouldn't normally click on an energy story, someone who thinks this is too technical or too far removed from daily life. Because what we are describing here, the decisions being made in offices in Hamburg and Halifax and Paris right now, will directly affect energy prices, industrial jobs, and economic growth across Europe for the next 2 decades. This is not a niche story. Share it. Let's keep going. Long-term offtake commitments are not complicated in principle. They are contracts in which a buyer commits to purchase a minimum annual volume of LNG over a specified number of years, typically between 15 and 20, at a pricing formula tied to commodity indices. What makes these contracts so important is that they are the financial instrument that makes terminal construction possible. A bank will not lend hundreds of millions of dollars to build an LNG export facility unless the facility has buyers contractually committed to purchasing its output over the amortization period of the investment. This is exactly how LNG Canada at Kitimat got built. A decade ago, Japanese and Korean utilities signed long-term offtake agreements that guaranteed the project's revenue stream well into the future. Those contracts made the terminal financeable. The terminal got built. The cargoes started flowing. When a German utility signs a comparable agreement with Goldboro LNG in April or May of 2026, the same mechanism activates. The terminal gets built. The cargoes flow. And the contracts written this spring will still be governing natural gas deliveries in 2041 and beyond. These are not emergency measures. They are the foundation of a new transatlantic energy relationship that will outlast several governments on both sides of the Atlantic. France is moving in the same direction, though with characteristically less public fanfare. Total Energies, the French oil and gas major, has been in active discussions with Canadian producers for months, covering both upstream equity partnerships and LNG offtake arrangements. The pace of those discussions has accelerated measurably since March 2nd. Engie and EDF, the major French utilities, are reported to be in advanced commercial conversations with multiple Canadian counterparties as well. Total Energies occupies a particularly interesting structural position in this story. The company already holds significant equity stakes in LNG projects across the United States, Mozambique, and Papua New Guinea. Its balance sheet can support upstream equity participation in Canadian production, which is a different and more substantial kind of commitment than a utility offtake contract. When Total Energies takes an equity stake in a Canadian LNG project, it is not simply buying molecules, it is underwriting the development risk of the entire project, which in the current financing environment is often the single factor that determines whether a project reaches final investment decision or sits on a planning document indefinitely. Now let's talk about volumes, because this is where the scale of what is happening becomes fully visible. Qatar supplied approximately 7% of European LNG imports in 2025. In absolute terms, against total European LNG imports of roughly 130 million tons that year. A 7% gap represents approximately 9 million tons of annual replacement demand. Some of that can be absorbed by existing suppliers increasing throughput. Some will come from demand destruction, which is already happening as energy-intensive industries curtail production or shift operations to lower-cost locations. But a significant portion has to come from genuinely new supply. That is the volume Atlantic Canadian LNG is being positioned to fill. Goldboro's projected capacity, once fully built out, approaches 10 million tons annually. Bearhead's proposed capacity is comparable. Together, those two projects alone could theoretically replace the entire volume that Qatar used to supply to European markets. In practice, cargoes will be distributed across multiple buyers in multiple countries, and Canadian projects will compete with expansion at existing facilities elsewhere. But the total European demand is large enough to anchor multiple new Atlantic Canadian export terminals simultaneously. And that is precisely why project financing that had been stalled for years is now beginning to move. Engineering firms are scaling up capacity. Ports from Halifax to St. John are revising their long-term capital plans to accommodate LNG tanker traffic at volumes they had previously considered aspirational rather than near-term. 3 forward scenarios are now being actively modeled by European energy planners, each with meaningfully different implications. In the first scenario, the Qatar disruption resolves within 6 to 9 months. Mine clearance in the Gulf succeeds. The naval situation stabilizes. Qatari LNG resumes at reduced but still significant levels. Even in this path, Atlantic Canadian LNG captures substantial market share because the contracts being signed right now run for 15 to 20 years. The pivot has already happened. The question is only how quickly new Canadian terminals get built. In the second scenario, the Qatar disruption extends for 1 to 3 years. Either the repair timeline proves accurate, or the Gulf security environment remains too volatile for commercial flows to fully resume. In this path, the European-Canadian pivot accelerates dramatically. Multiple new Atlantic Canadian projects receive final investment decisions within the next 12 to 18 months. Canadian LNG becomes a structural component of European supply rather than a supplementary one. The contracts being negotiated this spring become the foundation of an energy relationship that lasts for a generation. In the third scenario, the situation in the Persian Gulf escalates further. The ceasefire collapses. Additional energy infrastructure is damaged. Red Sea shipping becomes comprehensively impassable. European demand for alternative supply becomes urgent in a way that removes all remaining hesitation. The Canadian infrastructure timeline becomes the binding constraint on how quickly European industry can adapt. The Canadian federal government potentially intervenes directly to accelerate permitting and financing for critical export projects. And Canada emerges as Europe's single most important natural gas supplier, a position that would have seemed entirely implausible 18 months ago. What connects all three scenarios is the core structural learning that European planners have taken from this crisis. Their gas supply is vulnerable to disruptions in waterways they cannot control, caused by actors they cannot deter in regions where their political influence is limited. The response to that learning is not incremental adjustment. It is strategic repositioning towards suppliers whose routes to Europe do not pass through contested choke points and whose political systems align with European values and governance norms. Canada satisfies every condition on that list. It has proven gas reserves. It has infrastructure that is either operational or in late-stage development. It has political stability. It has democratic governance with a consistent track record of commercial reliability. It has a federal government under Mark Carney that is actively encouraging precisely this kind of strategic partnership. And it has geography, which cannot be changed by any political development on either side of the Atlantic. The North Atlantic shipping route from Atlantic Canada to Europe is the most commercially secure long-distance energy corridor in the world. No hostile state or non-state actor has meaningful ability to disrupt it. No insurance premium needs to be priced for Houthi drones or Iranian mines or Strait of Hormuz transit fees. A cargo that leaves Nova Scotia will reach Wilhelmshaven in 9 days under almost any foreseeable global conditions. 45 days ago, almost none of this was being seriously actioned. Goldboro was moving through its development phases, but without the urgency or the contractual anchoring that final investment decisions require. The German conversations were exploratory. The French discussions were commercial but unhurried. Bearhead was not a priority. The pipeline conversion possibilities were in planning documents, but not yet in ministerial briefings. Then Iranian drones hit Ras Laffan, and the map changed. Today, the contracts that will define European energy security through the 2030s and into the 2040s are being negotiated in real time. In offices in Hamburg and Halifax, in Paris and Calgary and Ottawa, by people who know that a potential winter supply crisis is roughly 7 months away and that the commitments made in the next 60 days will determine whether that crisis is manageable or genuinely painful for European households and businesses. The cargoes that used to go to Wilhelmshaven from Ras Laffan are not going there this year, probably not next year, possibly not for a decade. And here is what that means at a deeper level. This is the second time in 4 years that a single external shock has forced Europe to completely rethink where its energy comes from. The first time, it was a land war in Eastern Europe that severed pipeline connections built over decades of political and commercial cooperation. This time, it is a drone strike on a facility thousands of kilometers away in the Persian Gulf. Two entirely different causes, the same fundamental lesson. The world has more ways to interrupt European energy supply than European planners had fully accounted for. And every time that lesson is relearned, the strategic response is the same. Move towards suppliers that are harder to disrupt. move toward routes that are harder to close, move toward partners whose reliability is anchored in geography and governance rather than in the fragile assumption of continued regional stability. Canada is the beneficiary of that logic. Not because European governments suddenly developed a preference for Canadian gas over Qatari gas or American gas, but because when you map every available LNG source against every relevant criterion simultaneously, commercial viability, shipping security, political reliability, contracting flexibility, Canada's Atlantic coast keeps rising to the top of the list. Katharina Reike said it plainly. Politically speaking, she has no alternative. That sentence is not a complaint. It is a statement of economic reality that has been pressure-tested twice in 4 years, and it is now driving decisions that will still be governing energy flows when today's university students are in the middle of their careers. The contracts being drafted this April and May are not hedges against a possible future. They are commitments to a specific one. When the first major European-Canadian long-term offtake agreement is formally signed, and that moment is likely within the next 30 to 60 days, it will be more than a commercial announcement. It will mark the formal beginning of a transatlantic energy relationship that replaces frameworks built in a different era, under different assumptions, in a world that no longer quite exists. The tankers are being repositioned. The terminals are being expanded. The negotiators are already at the table. The engineering firms are already staffing up. The port authorities are already revising their capital plans. A small drone carrying a few hundred kilograms of explosive crossed a few hundred kilometers of airspace in the early morning hours of March 2nd and struck a specific piece of industrial infrastructure on the coast of Qatar. Its physical damage was real but contained. Its strategic impact is still unfolding. That is how the world actually changes, not through grand declarations at summits, not through policy papers or think tank reports, through specific physical events that collapse specific assumptions that had been quietly holding together enormously complex commercial systems. The assumption that collapsed on March 2nd was the idea that European energy security could be maintained through a diversified mix of suppliers that included Qatar as a stable structural component. That assumption is gone. The replacement is being built right now, one contract at a time across the North Atlantic. And the thing about infrastructure contracts of this kind, 15 years, 20 years, binding financial commitments backed by billions of dollars in capital investment, is that they are not reversible in any practical sense. Even if Ras Laffan were fully restored tomorrow, even if the Strait of Hormuz were completely secure and Qatar resumed exporting at full capacity next month, the contracts being signed this spring will still be running in 2041. The terminals being financed this year will still be operating in 2046. The transatlantic energy relationship being built right now will still be the foundation of European energy security when an entirely different generation of political leaders is making decisions in Berlin and Paris and Ottawa. That is what it means when a crisis forces a structural shift rather than a temporary adjustment. The conditions that made the old architecture viable are not coming back. Not this year. Probably not this decade. And the new architecture being built to replace it is not a stopgap. It is a permanent reorientation of where energy flows, who supplies it, and which relationships sit at the center of European economic life. Germany and France are not choosing Canada because they prefer it. They are choosing Canada because they have exhausted the alternatives. And that is, in the end, the most durable kind of strategic decision. The kind made not by aspiration, but by necessity. The kind that reshapes global commerce not because someone planned it, but because someone finally ran out of reasons to delay it. The paperwork is catching up to the reality. The reality is already underway, and the North Atlantic is about to become the most important energy corridor in the world. If this video helped you understand something important about how the world actually works, I want to ask one more thing of you. Not a like this time, not a subscribe reminder. Just go share this video somewhere a real conversation can happen. A group chat, a forum, a comment thread, wherever people in your life are actually trying to make sense of global events. The analysis in this video took real work to put together, and the best thing you can do with it is put it in front of someone who will push back, ask questions, and think harder because of it. That is how ideas spread. That is how understanding actually grows. Go start that conversation.